I don't think there would have been a single question that you would have got a buyer at £100 million for Bruno Guimaraes. Badly handled, I think, the director of football search generally. It's not possible to get to be a top 4 team in the Premier League consistently with the strategy that they had.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NUFC360 podcast. I'm your host, Stephen, and second episode in a row, we have a very special guest with us today. Northern football correspondent and Bradford City fanboy, Mark Douglas. Mark, how are you doing? Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. I like a weekend without Newcastle. Very interesting, but yeah, Bradford did actually win, so not too bad. Yeah, not too bad.
They've been scoring a few goals recently, haven't they?
They have, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, they've won the last 2, which is which they needed to after they'd gone on a little bit of a poor run. But I mean, there's nothing in League 2. You know, it's a very strange league.
Losing to Harrogate is certainly nothing. Yeah,
it's what we do every year. To be honest, I think we've only beaten them 3 or 4 times since they got promoted. So yeah, we're kind of used to that one, unfortunately.
Mark, you join us in an ongoing period of what I can only really describe as a pretty busy few months up here on Tyneside. We've had everything from, Paul Mitchell joining, Amandad Merdad leaving, Eddie Howe, the speculation about him leaving for England, the PSR fiasco, the transfer window fiasco, the upcoming or the anticipated departure of Darren Eales at some point, and a few other things beyond that, new stadium speculation and whatnot. How does this season rank in terms of just how much is going on for you, and what have you made of sort of everything at a high level so far?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's probably not even in the top 10, I wouldn't say, of kind of mad Newcastle United seasons, because there's always something going on up here. And of course, we had about 18 months of, will it happen, won't it happen with the takeover? So it felt like, I've got to be honest, it felt like at that point, you always had to keep your phone on you because you never knew when it was gonna happen. And in actual fact, when it did happen, it sort of came a little bit out of nowhere because we were being told a few days before it was never going to happen. So I think probably this year, look, a newsy year, it's fair to say. I mean, I think I would say that 2024, if 2023 was a kind of, a kind of miracle year in a lot of ways, finishing 4th, getting into Champions League, beating PSG, and having those incredible kind of away days. I think 2024 has been a little bit more of a kind of back down to earth year, back down to earth with a bump year. We've seen a lot of things happen that, I don't think were in the original script. I think if you'd said to people this time last year, there'd be no Amanda Staveley, there'd be no Merdad, new director of football, potentially, a new CEO probably by the end of the year, or maybe not by the end of the year, but into the start of next year, we'll have a new CEO. I always felt this year was going to be an interesting one because they had to, at some point, I think, come to the next stage of it, if you will. And you could have either gone one or 2 ways. It could have been PIF deciding to throw everything at it. Like, my feeling is, amongst a lot of that stuff, is that it could have gone one of 2 or 3 ways. Like, one of them would be PIF start to fight the PSR regulations and start throwing money at it. But I don't think that was ever going to happen. I don't think that's kind of where they sit. I don't think that's in their headspace. The second one was we could have seen some really radical changes in the playing staff in the summer. Now, I think the reason that didn't happen was because there weren't any bites for Bruno Guimaraes, which I think it was either him, it was maybe Joe Linton being sold, it was possibly Anthony Gordon being sold, or it was some big player to go, and therefore to give them the PSR room and maybe the funds to then go off and sign other players. When that didn't happen, they've sort of gone down this third route, which is that actually there's been a lot of off the field upheaval in terms of bringing in Paul Mitchell and maybe going down a slightly different route off the field. And there's been a bit of a reckoning for a lot of people within the club. Actually, you've seen Darren Eales has gone, Dan Ashworth went, but there had to be changes. I think there's been changes with Eddie, the way that they expect Eddie Howe to manage the team as well. I mean, this time last year he was kind of omnipotent. We knew that Amanda and Merdad were his biggest allies. They were in the club. Now it feels slightly different. It feels like he's being expected to do things slightly differently. He's, I think, going to have to adapt in the upcoming January window. Maybe being expected to work a little bit more with overseas players as well. So things have changed. There's been an awful lot of change. But at the end of it, the one thing that I thought would happen would be that there would be a few new players there would maybe be one big player of having gone. But actually, what we've ended up is this: that we're probably going to get to the end of 2024 with a very similar team, but a lot of things behind the scenes changing. A lot of maybe our understanding of PAF changing as well. So it's felt like there's been a lot of things happen, but actually, what has actually changed within the football club? Well, behind the scenes stuff, but really stadium, squad, those kind of big ticket things that we look to the club to maybe make it, they haven't changed. So it's been a weird year, a really strange year. And I think if they finish it in the top 5, in the top 6, then it will be a decent year. But I'd like to see something. I'd like to see them kick on a bit in 2025.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I agree. I mean, especially when you add in the fact, I mean, we heard from the club, I think it was Darren Eales, who promised a transformative summer. And obviously, I don't think any of us, like you say, I don't think any of us anticipated that transformative sort of phase being behind the scenes. I think I think it's in one of your recent articles from a few days ago, you mentioned that I think it was PIF in particular had handed down the directive to avoid any PSR issues sort of at all costs. Is that sort of where the what you mentioned about maybe Bruno or Gordon or Joelinton being one of the sort of big ticket saleable assets? Is that where that sort of comes from? That attitude on sales, or was it more of because it did seem sort of outwardly it seemed more reactive?
I think what happened was there were a few different things that have changed the business model. The fact that the transfer market has effectively collapsed in the last 2-3 windows because of what's happened with PSR and the fines that were meted out to Everton. That has and so many clubs being so close to their PSR limit, and you can see it's not just Newcastle, there are 4 or 5 clubs in the summer having to do some pretty desperate late dealings, and we'll see in January, of course, whether that's happened and whether there are some teams that do end up facing charges. So that was one of the things that I think changed the entire business model. The idea that you could go out and I don't think they were actively trying to sell Bruno, but I think they were obviously open to offers because of the transfer clause, the clause that was in his contract. If that had been the case a year before, I don't think there would have been a single question that you would have got a buyer at £100 million for Bruno Guimaraes, because you look at the players who went for 100 million in that summer, and it was clear that he is in that bracket, and I think good enough to do that. The fact that then there wasn't a taker at that price, I think it was probably as much the number of clubs that could come in for him was reduced because of PSR concerns. So it did have an impact on Newcastle. I think they also probably, got very, very close to the limit. And they've obviously had to roll that back. For me, that feels like a little bit of a failing of a transfer of a policy in some ways. There was always going to be some fallout from that, I think, and that's probably what we saw in the summer. The reason I think the PIF didn't want the PSR issues to become a big problem is because one of the things that fund is all about is good governance. It's all about when we talk about it being an investment that makes sense, and they're very methodical, they're very process driven. I think the idea that they would breach PSR and the idea that they talk a good game about 5-10 year plans, and then to basically break the rules within 2 years or 3 years, it attracts bad attention for the Saudi PIF. It causes a load of issues for them, and also it makes them look like they're taking their eye off the ball. So I think that was why that directive came down. I think that was why you saw so much kind of desperation, if you will, from Newcastle to maybe do the late deals. But I think that's why then you're looking at now Paul Mitchell coming in and talking about a slightly different policy, talking about a different way of selling players, a different way of buying players, and maybe why they walked away from the Mark Gay deal in the summer was because we don't want to get ourselves into this situation again. What we now need to see is a sort of coherent strategy and a coherent idea and a much better, I think, articulated vision of what Newcastle United is going to be, because we've had on one hand Amanda Stavely talking about going into the Manchester City training ground and thinking, I can't wait until we win the lot, and Yasser Al-Rahman on the Amazon documentary talking about we want to be number one in Europe, number one in the world. And then Darren Eales maybe last January talking in quite a downbeat tone about where the club was going to be for the next 12 months. I think actually that was the accurate portrayal of where the club were because of the PSR situation. And then obviously we had what we had in the summer, which was, I don't think he ever actually said it was going to be a transformative summer, but I think he talked about spending right to the limit. He talked about, this week, there can be a measure of optimism about where we go from here. And then obviously, as it turned out, that wasn't the case, because it was badly handled, I think, the director of football search generally. And then they got to the end of this situation and ended up going back to Paul Mitchell, who was the first person they kind of talked to, and effectively saying to him, here's the keys to the castle, you decide what you want to do. Well, if you're going to do that, you really have to prep the manager and kind of bring some buy-in to it. Well, I don't think there was that, which is why we saw the tension that there was. So look, it's all settled down now. We're getting into January. There is some PSR headroom, clearly. Whether they do anything in January, I'm not 100% convinced that they will do anything huge. It'll depend where they are. It'll depend what the injury situation looks like. And they're probably going to end up like maybe trying to take somebody who is available for a good price. But January's not the best market. So I think it'll be 2025 and maybe into the summer when we start to see what the really big changes are. But, look, Paul Mitchell's, what he said, his interview that he did in September, puts a sort of target on his back a little bit. If he doesn't make the changes, if things aren't markedly better than they were in the summer, then he will end up, he won't be able to then turn around and say, well, it's somebody else's plan, it's somebody else's club. He will be accountable to it. So I think they'll probably try to do something in January. Whether they actually end up doing it or not, we'll see. But there is a bit of pressure on the club to kind of get that right. I think that's the next step for them. So really interesting. But yeah, it has been a bit of a change, I think, this year. And we have seen the transfer policy has to change, I think, a little bit, because what they did have before isn't fit for maybe the PSR world that we're in now.
Yeah, I mean, you used the word fit. I mean, obviously, Paul Mitchell notably said that the recruitment process internally wasn't fit for purpose, right? And I think we said on an episode of this podcast after the transfer window closed as a sort of review that Mitchell and co and his team and Eddie Howe as an overall recruitment sort of process and committee they have until January to, like you say, to get that strategy in place, to get that process fixed. Probably part of that strategy would probably be trying to sort of maximize any value of any sort of outgoings of what might now be fringe players. One you recently reported on was the sort of revived interest in Miguel Almiron. How likely do you think it is for that deal to be done? I think you were saying that in the article in the Eye recently that the club wants close to probably their target of about 15 million as possible. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you can never tell really whether there's a little bit of jostling going on at this point because it's so far away from January really that it's like, the idea that the clubs would necessarily show their hand right now. I suppose you are aware of that, but. Look, in the summer they did have offers. That there have been offers for Miguel Almiron, but they've very much stuck to their guns. And I think the offer that was there from Charlotte in the summer originally was not a million miles away from the kind of asking price of maybe 12 to 15 million. It changed because of demands from the player and the agent as well. So they came in with a lower offer that was then rejected, and then the deal basically fell through. I think this is where really we get to the bones of the situation. Is to look, Eddie Howe, I think, is a reluctant seller in a lot of ways. With some of those first team players that he's got, he possibly sees it as, I'm not 100% sure whether I'm going to end up getting a replacement of the same equivalent value, or I'm not going to get a replacement who can play the way that I need them to play, because it is an interesting system. It's a different system from how other clubs play. And it does. You've seen it takes some players time to kind of adapt. Some players get into it straight away. Some players take time to adapt. Anthony Gordon came in January and took almost half a season really to get used to it and get right for it. So maybe there's a bit of that with him, but I think it's come to a point where I think something has to change. They can't hang on to players for longer than their market value. The time to sell Miguel Almiron was 18 months ago when his stock was high, and obviously, look, he'd had a really, really good season. So possibly the idea was that we keep him. We need all the players we can for the Champions League. But what happened was always what's going to happen. He was going to revert to maybe where he is now, which is slightly, not a player who's going to score 10 to 15 goals a season. He's a player who's going to be a fringe player on a Premier League team that's aiming for the top six. And there is interest in him. So it would make sense to sell him. They obviously don't want to sell him for nothing. They don't want to sell him for a very cheap price. But I think they've probably got to be realistic about the value that they can get for him now. He's obviously got, he will have another 18 months left on his contract by January. So, don't want to sell him too cheap. If you've got right-wing targets, maybe a younger player who can come in. You've got Jacob Murphy, who looks like he's number one choice. You've got, Anthony Gordon could play on the right. Harvey Barnes could play on the right. They haven't done it particularly well this season, I've got to say. But you have got other options there. So it makes sense to get rid of Almiron. But it's just, I think at this point, they see him as an important part of the first team. But I think this is where difficult decisions need to be made, and difficult decisions need to be made not just now, but maybe in the summer as well, and then the following transfer windows as well, because they've almost, in some ways, ignored or not like kind of kicked the can down the road on a lot of those sales. And I think that's where there is a problem. They kick the can down on some of those sales and have ended up selling what, in my opinion, would have been the long-term answer to the right wing problem, which is Yankuba Minter and Elliot Anderson, who probably would have played. I mean, he's in the under 21 team. He's done very well for a Forest side that have started well this season. So, that's where you end up if you end up selling from a position of kind of weakness. That's what they ended up doing. So they've got to remedy that selling situation. They had a very good first 3 transfer windows post takeover. I think first 3 or 4 maybe, and pretty poor last 2. So really, if we're not talking about a kind of it being an existential failure of a recruitment policy at Newcastle United, they really need to do something well in January and then maybe into the following summer as well, because I think at the moment their focus is too narrow. They aren't making the most of the overseas market. I think they've done very well bringing in overseas players so far, but they didn't have, I think in January and then again this summer, they didn't have the options there that maybe, or they weren't going all out for the options that maybe had been provided for them international wise as well. So clearly improvements need to be made recruitment wise, and that definitely includes selling. And I think, look, if Almiron is still here at the end of the next summer transfer window, I think they failed, to be honest with you, because he hasn't played many games. He has played
30 minutes of football, I think, this season.
Yeah. I think it's because he came on against Everton. Look, I can see him playing a part this year, but it was the season when probably they didn't need as big a squad because they're not in Europe. It would have made sense to sell him this summer.
We've said the same sort of thing in previous episodes, that especially by the end of the summer window. I mean, if Almiron was still had a large sort of role in the squad, either as a starter or as just a backup who can take a lot of minutes, it would have been, I think, a failure then, not just by the end of next summer. I mean, you talk about some of the foreign market signings. I mean, you'd be thinking immediately of some of the big ticket names, obviously Tonali, Isak, Bruno, and Botman being the sort of the big 4. Paul Mitchell, obviously coming in, he has this reputation for finding either young players or undervalued players, especially from foreign markets. When you look at his roles at Leipzig, Tottenham, and Monaco, obviously we've had a sort of a Premier League experience focus for a lot of the signings, or a lot of the reported interest under Eddie Howe. Do you think that with the sort of the departure of Amanda and Murdad, as you say, as Eddie Howe's sort of biggest allies at the club, do you think there is likely that we will go for a much more sort of Europe or international sort of strategy in future windows?
Yeah, I think look, the 2 markets that are going to possibly get you some value in this in the current transfer market are overseas, because there are a lot of clubs. I think a lot of clubs in other markets who probably need the money as well. So you can get a decent price with some of those clubs, and you've seen some of the teams, some of the players that have come in from overseas teams who've done really well. I mean, I think of a player like Kudos at West Ham, who came in and did has done really, really well for them. Whereas Newcastle have kind of been looking at Premier League markets. So I think the overseas market is one. I think the other one is, this massive churn of very, very talented young players that are coming out of English academies, where you can, and Newcastle have already tapped that a little bit by getting Lewis Hall in. And I think that's somewhere else they'll look as well, because they feel that there's maybe some value in that market. And that's where teams, because of PSR, are willing to sell as well. The problem that Newcastle have at the moment is they've been looking at this kind of market of, established, proven Premier League players. Now, the problem with that is it does improve you immediately if you go out and get those players, and obviously Mark Gay would have improved Newcastle massively, but the price tags are huge, and you're just going to find it very difficult to deal with Premier League clubs as well. So it can happen. You can go and get them. Obviously they did very well getting Anthony Gordon for the price they got him. I think they could probably get double their money for him now, but it's a very, very difficult market to go out and get players in every window and stay within PSR. So yeah, I think they'll definitely go overseas. I think what you'll probably see as well is a few more kind of Minter-esque signings as well. So that's the route they've got to go, and they know that was one. They've managed to get 4 times what they paid for him, which obviously solved their PSR problems as well. But he was a very, very good player, and I think we were talking just before we came on air here about some of the additions they're making in the loans department. Clearly, that's somewhere that's been a little bit understaffed in the last few years. And it's obvious that they're going to take that very seriously. They're going to make bringing in younger players and then improving the loans department in order for that to be a kind of hothouse for talent is going to be the way that they're going to go and try and solve their PSR issue as well. So yeah, clearly these are the kind of behind the scenes moves that they've needed to make for a few years. It feels like whether it's Mitchell's influence directly or whether these were things that were going to be done anyway, it does feel like they're moving on that, which I think is a really good thing. Really good thing.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned whether or not it's pre-Mitchell. I think I would probably lean on that being the case. I think we've heard Dan Ashworth in the past when he was still, not sending emails to outside parties from a Newcastle email address. He's mentioned before. I think Eels had mentioned and Amanda had all mentioned player trading being core to the long-term business model, right? I mean, as you mentioned, clubs have to sell nowadays for PSR purposes. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the sort of the academies market in England. I mean, obviously, you look at I think notably for those of us who have the time to watch a lot of under-21s games or under-16 games, sometimes like I find myself doing. You see the likes of Trevan Sanusi, who obviously excited fans in preseason. Alfie Harrison had a sort of, for a young player, a relatively high-profile move from City. We've got Sam Alabi, who's performing quite well for England at the moment, and like Travis Hearns, Leo Shahar, a lot of these sort of exciting young English talents who are all coming through as well. I'd imagine those will probably feature highly long term as well. You mentioned like some of the additions to the loans department. We've seen, I mean, being a bit of a stats nerd myself, it's quite interesting that we've sort of seemed to be going in a more sort of data-led direction, particularly under Paul Mitchell. It wasn't too long ago that I think we signed a partnership with StatsBomb as well as a data partner. I think you go back far enough in the Premier League, you see a few clubs sort of setting up their own sort of dedicated sort of large data teams. I think Arsenal were a particular pioneer in that. How much of a focus has there been on recruitment in data? How much of a role do you see that taking in long term?
Well, it's funny you say that because I've actually got a piece coming up like tomorrow morning, which is very much key on that. Like we've spoken to StatsBomb themselves about the kind of Newcastle partnership, and we've kind of gone into it. I think it's a long-term thing with that. It's look, it's not as if Newcastle aren't doing any data at the moment. They certainly are. I mean, I've spoken to a few people there talking about some of the things that they are doing, and some of the things that they have done. They've built some pretty good systems at Newcastle, but I think look, they're still way off the very, very cutting edge, top of the game people. I think what they really, really do need is they need to bring it in as part of the recruitment and talent ID a little bit more, possibly from where they were more, maybe they were a little bit more scouting led, and then data comes into it. Maybe they need to go the other way and start to look at like data as a starting point and really integrate it into the strategy. When Paul Mitchell talks about it being data aligned, that means the entire club starting to use that data to maybe do a little bit more talent ID. And that means overseas market, because you're not going to get into, you're not going to get into some of those overseas markets if you're not able to use data and you're not able to identify some of those untapped talents through data. It's the only way that you can do it. You can't have eyes on the ground at some of these places without utilizing data really well. And doing that is a skill. It's easy to say. A lot of clubs talk about data. Manchester United have probably one of the biggest data departments in the Premier League. They have some really, really smart people there. But their transfer and recruitment policy has been all over the shop. I mean, you can't tell me that any data team worth their salt would have identified Casemiro at the age that he was at as value. I mean, it was clear when he signed, but that was just a horrendous decision. I think probably if you look at all the signings that Newcastle have made, I think probably most of them, the data would have been quite good on them. So the question is whether they've got value and whether there were other options that they could have gone for that maybe would have given them a little bit more value. So yeah, I'll leave. I won't go into it too much, given that I've done the piece tomorrow. So there's quite a lot of stuff in there that you're probably quite interested in on that one. But I think that's a long-term thing that I think really has to get into. But yeah, I mean, clearly Paul Mitchell, judging on his previous roles, he's been really across data. It's been a big part of what he's been able to do in terms of talent ID. And I think it's, Newcastle needed to get to that point. We were beginning to drift, I think, and I think this is one of the reasons why what happened in the summer happened. We were drifting into a model, I think, where Eddie Howe was possibly the all-important voice on everything at Newcastle United. And, he probably earned the right to do that through some of the good performances of the team, but it's just not a model that any football club uses anymore. The all-important, all-seeing, all-knowing coach, just nobody does that anymore. And I think the problem with doing that is as well that you go down the route of you recruit for a manager. If the manager walks, gets the England job, say, or, decides that he doesn't like the new director of football, and they've got a new CEO coming in as well. So that's another important relationship that he has to manage, and that Newcastle have to manage with him as well. You are left with a squad that is probably built for one man, and then you're really recruiting for a different kind of manager. You look at Manchester City in the way that they're kind of like looking for a new manager come the end of the season. That will be a squad that obviously it's built for Pep, but there will be other managers who can come in and take it. I think that's possibly where Newcastle have to be if they're going to be a super club. I don't want to get into the situation that we were in 5 or 6 years ago, where when Rafa Benitez walks out of the football club, you're in a situation where you're just like, that was the only talent we had. That was the talent.
Yeah. There was no succession planning. Yeah.
Awful. And Newcastle can't be that again. If they're going to be a super club, they have to prepare actively for life after Eddie Howe. They have to prepare for life after Paul Mitchell. They have to prepare for life after Darren Eales. That's how proper football, really good football clubs work now.
And not even just football clubs, right? It's just businesses in general. Any good organization worth its salt should always have a plan for when a key person leaves, right? I mean, it's interesting you mention other clubs, particularly going back to the point on data. I think you mentioned Man United. I think on the other end of that spectrum, we've seen, Chelsea have tried to hire everyone from Brighton, and to sort of proving your point, you can hire all the recruitment guys from Brighton, but you can't replace what Brighton have, which is Star Lizard, which is Tony Bloom's analytics company that provides Brighton's data, right? And it's, there's no money on earth that you could offer him outside of something truly biblical, I'd imagine, that would make him part with that. One of the most divisive topics among Newcastle United's fan base through the summer window and post-summer window is between Howe and Paul Mitchell. Obviously, people we've touched on quite a bit. Earlier on in this show, you mentioned like how that relationship's going to work long term and how it will impact transfers. Is there any inkling as to how that relationship is at the moment? Obviously, I'd imagine the public message would be, oh, it's all grand, and they're working, improving that relationship every day. Is there any inkling as to where it is or it stands right now?
I think, like, to be fair, even the people who kind of like inside the club who talk freely about how things have been would say that there were problems in the summer in terms of some disagreements and possibly two quite strong characters. And I think Paul Mitchell's clearly a quite strong, quite direct character. Eddie Howe in his own way, I think probably not quite so direct in a lot of his mannerisms and the way that he talks, but a very strong character in himself as well. A guy who will let you know in no uncertain terms if he feels that he doesn't agree with your point. Two strong characters. As I said, I think at the start of the show, I think it was botched the way that the director of football was brought in. They looked at so many different people, interviewed very, very different people. Johannes Sporer, who was the 777 sporting director, got down to the last two. They went for Dougie Freeman was a possibility. He's a kind of more of a wheeler dealer kind of director of football. He's done the job at Palace. They interviewed Thiago Pinto, who was obviously at Roma, who ended up going to Bournemouth as their head of, I think, global football. And, they were looking at Hugo Viana, who's obviously ending up at Man City. They were looking at all kinds of different people, and then ended up with Paul Mitchell, who was the person that they'd end up with in the first place. So I think it didn't really work. And then I think the fact that was, I don't think, very well communicated to Eddie in the summer, very much a case of, almost ripping up what they kind of prepared for. He thought he was going to be, playing a big part in everything that was going to go on in the summer. The fact that Mitchell missed this PSR sort of frantic deadline, it created a really, really difficult dynamic. And we went out to Germany. There was a few of us. All the Northeast press pack pretty much went out to Germany. I was there as well, and we got introduced to Paul Mitchell, and it was very amenable, very very nice. I seems like a really good bloke. We got on well with him, talking to him. But then, and we were kind of told, look, I think Eddie will probably put some distance between himself and the England rumours, and he did, but in the way of that kind of explosive interview, really setting aside the fact that it was clear that he wasn't particularly happy at that time, wanted to get some reassurances, I think, that this can work. So there was clear tensions. Even people at the time, everybody admits there were tensions and there have been problems. The latest that I'd heard, which was did my piece around a couple of weeks ago, I think it was maybe 2-3 weeks ago, that they'd had that conversation, because we'd all focused on whether they were talking at the time, and it was very much like they'd gone obviously after the transfer window, after Mitchell's interview, and then I think a further week, wasn't it? A further week after that they'd kind of like they'd not spoken. Yeah. But I never felt at the time. I never felt like in the summer it had reached crisis point. Because they're two people who have to work together. I don't think there's any, you don't necessarily have to like or particularly kind of like love everybody that you work with, but you have to get that professional relationship. Now, I think there were definitely differences of opinion. What emerged from the first chat that they had, the one that I reported, was that those differences had largely been settled. I think in terms of how, they felt that they were going to go and do things. A few red lines agreed on, no player was going to come into Newcastle United without Eddie Howe kind of agreeing it. There was nobody going to be brought in over his head, which obviously was, as we've had before at Newcastle United, but a long, long time ago. Supposedly, from what I've been told, and quite a lot of these differences have been ironed out, and they're kind of working on building a kind of collaborative approach towards January. So things seem pretty good from that perspective. I don't think there's been any fallouts. I don't think there's been any of that kind of thing. Paul Mitchell's been getting on with updating and kind of going through and auditing, if you will, quite a lot of the ways that the club are working differently. Look, I hear that he's been quite interested in the academy and sort of getting on pretty well with Steve Harper as well, which is obviously a good thing as well. I've said, and I've written a few times, the difference is people are viewing it through a prism of main thing is Eddie Howe needs to be kept happy. But PIF are the owners, and PIF are the ones who've given Paul Mitchell this role. So you've got to look at it from that perspective. Is like, they are the owners. This is the way that they want to go. So, Eddie has a choice, doesn't he? Really, he either gets on with it and formulates a relationship, which I think is what he's going to do, or he decides to go for the England job. And I don't think he really wants to do the England job. And I don't think the problems were ever profound enough in the summer for him to feel that this is an unworkable relationship. And we had a little run, didn't we, of about 4 or 5 weeks of headlines, which were saying, this is untenable. One person is going to have to go. And the people that I was speaking to were saying, well, that's not the case. It's not that untenable. It's not that bad. PIF have given him the keys to the castle. He has to show and prove now, or he will be held accountable to it. And the one thing I would say for Paul Mitchell, which is, I think counts quite well for him in a way, is that by doing the interview that he did, people kind of portrayed as a bit of a car crash in some ways. Well, I'm not sure it was necessarily, because he came in, he set out his stall. He's probably pushed the dial a little bit. So now people are kind of understand where he's coming from, understand what he's all about. And secondly, he's admitting he will be accountable for what he's doing. He's coming out, he's setting out he could have easily come in and just sort of quietly blended into the background and not really said anything and sort of, let all the kind of criticism of everything linger and not really answer anything. But he didn't do that. He came out and he said, I'm going to sort it, and it's going to take 3-4 years, but we're going to do this. We've got a lot of ambition. Fair enough, fair enough. And I kind of
acting like someone in a leadership position should do. You'd imagine.
And I think that was always my feeling about directors of football, was like they're almost unaccountable. They never got sacked when things don't go very well. It's always the manager who gets sacked. Well, I think we're moving into a new era with directors of football because they're more high profile, and we're maybe going down to the European model where they talk more, almost the general manager model, if you will, in some ways. Yeah. And he's part of that. He's part of that that transition into that. And he said himself before we did the interview, I'd like to come and do these interviews more regularly. You'll be hearing more from me. Whether given the way that it was presented, he will end up doing that. I don't know. There's been an awful lot of criticism, but I personally feel that there's, it wasn't the disaster that was portrayed. And, look, maybe he did put a few people's noses out of joint, but that was needed at Newcastle.
Yeah.
My feeling is like, if you want to be the best, they've done really well getting to the point where they've got with the strategy and the systems that they've done. But it's not possible to get to be a top 4 team in the Premier League consistently with the strategy that they had, because PSR has changed that. And the way that PSR has developed, even in the last 2-3 years, has changed that. It would be a great strategy if you could make signings like Bruno and like Isak and like, the smart signings that they made. If you could do that every year without sacrificing, while raising money from players that you don't, it would be absolutely the way to go. But that is not possible. And we know it's not possible now because it's clearly not something they've been able to do. So you have to change it. It may not be Paul Mitchell. Paul Mitchell might be the wrong pick. But I'll tell you now, if Paul Mitchell goes, the idea that they would bring in somebody who is not aligned to that strategy is for the birds. It would be somebody else similar. So this is the model that they are going to go for. And it's up to the people involved now to make it work. And I think they can make it work. It may take a little bit longer. They may have to be a little bit more honest about what the short-term, medium-term and long-term aims are. Like, where are we going with this football club? Because I think at the moment, it's a little bit muddled, the message. But that is maybe part of what Paul Mitchell's in here to do. Maybe he's in here to break a few eggs. And if it doesn't work for him, the next guy gets the benefits of what he's done. But I don't have a problem with Paul Mitchell coming in. I don't have a problem with Paul Mitchell saying what he said. Eddie Howe does, but by the same token, maybe we've all got to kind of change a little bit, and maybe Eddie needs to accept that there are probably players out there who will fit his system, who he may be not quite as aware of, and he may not be able to run the same background checks, the same personality checks that he has been able to on some of the players that he obviously really wanted, the Gays of this world, and the kind of Anthony Gordons of this world, who players he really wanted, Harvey Barnes, if you will. Yeah, I think possibly when you talk about players that they've kind of overpaid for, and and looking at maybe why did they say, like, I'd like Harvey Barnes, I think he's a really good player, but they've got 2 left wingers who could potentially play for England, and you sort of wonder what has kind of happened there and why they've ended up with that, and they've not, and they've got a lot of goalkeepers, and so there's clearly things that need to change. And go back to your initial question, I think they've got a professional relationship now. I don't think they're ever going to be closest allies. But maybe that's not what's needed. Maybe there just needs to be some healthy tension in the room when you talk about transfers. It's easy to do it now, isn't it? Because I wouldn't have thought Eddie and Paul are necessarily need to talk all the time at this point. But I think in kind of December, moving into January, that's when this relationship will be kind of stress tested, if you will, because there will be some difficult conversations to be had moving towards the new year. And I think when the market opens up in January, we'll see what happens. It could be a really interesting sort of month, and it wouldn't surprise me if there were a few stories about tensions, things like that coming out in January as well, because there will be clearly some difficult decisions to be made, and those decisions are never kind of never come to from an easy perspective. What I would like them to have done, and what would be fantastic, would be if they've got somebody lined up a kind of, do you remember when Virgil van Dijk signed for Liverpool, and it was kind of December the 29th or something, and they had that picture of him, didn't they? Kind of, here he is, he's here, we've signed him pre-contract, it's all sorted. It would be brilliant if they were in that position and they kind of managed to get somebody in before the window started and really made a kind of positive and direct
decisive moves, and the kind of moves that really well-run clubs tend to make.
100%, yeah. Or go and get somebody without fuss. I mean, when Gay started, when it became a saga, I think I kind of said at the time, and obviously, like, look, it still kind of rumbled on, didn't it, to the end of the window, and it was very, it didn't sort of resolve until right at the end of the window. But I think when things become a saga, it's difficult. It's difficult to kind of get them done, and it does happen sometimes. But you look at Bruno was done in about a week, Isak was done in about 48 hours. Gordon did become a saga, but that was because Everton were, haggling for as much as they could. But a lot of the players that Newcastle got outside, Nick Pope, I think, was done within about 48 hours of that story first kind of breaking in. That's what you want. That's what they need to do. and it's a test of your sort of journalistic chops in some ways, because you want to get the story early. But look, it's very difficult to get when a deal's pretty much done and there's trust between the two parties and nobody's trying to kind of get a message out there. It is difficult for it's difficult for you to get the story, and usually by the time you've got it, it's kind of done, which is probably what fans prefer as well, to be honest. Certainly what we prefer if we get the story.